Hi friends, if you're enjoying this series and you'd like to help me reach even more people with thinking faith, please consider supporting the show. Silver supporters get early access to episodes and bonus content. Gold supporters also get signed books and a monthly catch-up with me. The links to support are with the show notes or visit justinbrierley.com. Enjoy today's episode.
Okay, David Chalmers, you are a philosophy professor here at New York University. And last night here at the university, a 25-year-old bet was settled and you won a case of fine wine. How do you feel about it?
Well, the wine was great. We opened the first bottle. Now there's only 5 left.
Okay, great.
But the wine was amazing. 1978 Madeira. So I was counting on maybe a 1998 wine, but it was like 20 years of 20 years bonus.
I also had a sip and it was great. Yeah. Right. And you lost a bet. How do you feel about that?
Oh, that's good.
This is philosopher David Chalmers and neuroscientist Christoph Koch being interviewed about a famous 25-year-old bet that got settled at a conference on consciousness last year.
So we got to, arguing about this and discussing this. There was a conference dinner in the Rathaus Keller, and then we went out for a drink, and Christoph was probably emboldened by a few drinks, and he said, we're going to figure this out. We're going to figure this out within 25 years. I said, well, not so fast.
Can I just correct the historical record?
Sure.
Right.
Despite any alcohol I may or may not have had, I don't admit to anything, I was very enthusiastic, partly because, you're young, you believe in what you do. I was a physicist turned a neuroscientist, and I said, of course we're going to nail it. It's an empirical program. It doesn't depend on metaphysical assumption. We can all agree there's going to be some footprints, and so let's do it.
You may be wondering, what exactly was the bet that won David Chalmers a case of wine? Well, when it comes to the mind, Christoph Koch believes that our conscious experiences can ultimately be reduced to and fully explained by physical processes in the brain. Chalmers disagrees and thinks that we need more than a purely material understanding of the mind. Christian thinker Sharon Dirckx told me what the bet they made was all about.
And what happened was, if I go back to 1998, Christoph Koch said, look, neuroscience is going to crack human consciousness. Give us 25 years, we'll have it sorted. And if I'm wrong, I'll give you a case of wine. And basically, they made this deal back in 1998. Actually, they had their initial showdown in 94, but it took them another 4 years to place the bet. And so they met last year in 2023, and basically David Chalmers said to Christoph on the stage, it's clear that things are not clear. The neuroscience is still all over the place. You clearly haven't cracked consciousness. And knowing this, Christoph Koch walked off the stage and brought back on a case of wine to give to philosopher David Chalmers. In other words, completely acknowledging that the neuroscience has not solved this problem in 25 years of throwing the brightest minds at it.
So Koch has admitted defeat to Chalmers for now, but the pair have said they'll reassess the situation in another 25 years.
He'll be 92, I think I'll be 82. Let's hope that anti-aging technology keeps us around.
Yeah.
Maybe AI will be in place and they will have found the neural correlative consciousness for us and simultaneously extended biological immortality to each of us.
I'm really hoping that we will meet again in 25 years.
Now, of course, that doesn't mean we don't want an elegant neuroscience of human consciousness. Of course, we want to know all of the processes that are going on in all kinds of different conscious states. But the view that those physical processes alone are going to solve this is, I think, actually slightly waning as we've thrown as much as we can at it and are seeing that we're not getting there. It's more complex than that. There's more mystery in the universe than simply physics and chemistry. And I think maybe there's a sense of that mystery, even amongst neuroscientists. But of course, they've made another bet for another 25 years. And if they're still alive, then there might be another case of wine that comes out. We'll see.
Like Sharon, I believe that something significant has happened in recent years to the conversation on mind, brain and consciousness. And while today's show will involve another dive into some philosophically deep waters, we'll also discover why this is not just about debates between intellectuals on conference stages. As we'll hear, the way we see the world, either as a purely material place of physics and chemistry, or as a cosmos teeming with wonder, love and meaning, makes a huge difference to the life we end up living.
What is he in a strict atheist materialist worldview? And I said, oh, isn't he a precious little randomly evolved set of chemical reactions that is destined to extinction along with the rest of humanity? And as I looked at that, I thought, I do not believe that this is true.
As we continue our current act looking at mind, meaning and materialism, I'll be asking whether, when it comes to brains, consciousness and neuroscience, we may be seeing a rebirth of belief in the soul. I'm Justin Brierley, and throughout my working life, I've been hosting conversations on faith between atheists, agnostics and believers. In this documentary series, I'm telling the story of why new atheism grew old and secular thinkers are considering Christianity again. I'm speaking to those inside and outside the atheist movement and the many new thinkers beginning a new conversation on the value of faith. Along the way, we'll meet some of those who have found themselves surprised by God as they've made the journey from atheism to Christianity. Welcome to the surprising rebirth of belief in God, episode 25, The Believing Brain. Well, just before we get into the rest of today's show, someone we've heard from quite a bit on the podcast is author and speaker Glenn Scrivener. Hello, Glenn.
Hey, Justin. Always great to be here.
Well, for a while now, you've been happily pointing people to your online course 321. Where did that come from?
It's a passion of mine to help people get to grips with Christian faith and to do it in a way that's attractive and imaginative and deep and that assumes no prior knowledge. So 321 is my way of showing life according to Jesus. We want it to be like a mere Christianity for a digital age.
Okay, so that sounds like it's maybe more for those who are not Christians?
Well, yeah, many people have done it who are not Christians, and they've found faith for the first time. We're thrilled about that. But like with Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, Christians love that book too. And the first audience we have in mind for 321 is actually a Christian who wants to be refreshed in their faith and to have something to pass on to their Christian curious friends and family.
Okay, so Christian or not, this basically gets people to the heart of the faith.
Right, and nearly 10,000 people have joined the online platform. It's free. You watch these video-led sessions and you think through the stunning animations, you engage with the chat community, you get a ton of extra content thrown in, and now you have on your phone a Mere Christianity that you can share with others. So the phrase we're using is, you can share this without shame, without cost, and without delay.
Well, we've been really enjoying promoting 321, and listeners to this podcast can get into it instantly by going to 321course.com/JB. That's 321course.com/JB. Thanks, Glenn.
Thank you, Justin. Keep up the good work.
Consciousness is one of the fundamental facts of human existence. Each of us is conscious. We all have our own inner movie. You, and you, and you. There's nothing we know about more directly. At least I know about my consciousness directly. I can't be certain that you guys are conscious. Consciousness also is what makes life worth living. If we weren't conscious, nothing in our lives would have meaning or value. But at the same time, it's the most mysterious phenomenon in the universe. Why are we conscious? Why do we have these inner movies? Why aren't we just robots who process all this input, produce all that output, without experiencing the inner movie at all? Right now, nobody knows the answers to those questions.
This is an excerpt from a 2014 TED Talk by philosopher of mind David Chalmers. To date, it's had over 5 million views. Chalmers explains how all of us experience pleasure, pain, emotions, taste, touch, sight and smell as an inner movie, a stream of consciousness which we are the subject of. For many years, with the growth of neuroscience, many scientists and thinkers coming from an atheist materialist perspective have concluded that our conscious experience, as vivid as it is caused purely by physical brain activity. One of the most popular advocates of the position was philosopher Daniel Dennett. Make sure to listen to our last episode for an in-depth account of the impact Dennett made on philosophy up to the time of his death earlier this year. In 2018, he joined me, along with Christian philosopher Keith Ward, for a big conversation from Premier Unbelievable.
Now, the brain's the hardware, but the organization of the brain is the software. And what we can do as human beings depends very much on the software that we've downloaded through culture, on our language and on all our reading and the tricks that we've learned and the tools that we've learned how to use. All of that has to be embodied in the brain, but it's information. It can be passed from person to person, doesn't weigh anything. It's like poetry.
But sticking with this computer analogy, I guess when I use a computer, I can see the hardware and I know what the software does and the way it processes everything. But there still has to be a me that it means anything to. It won't mean anything to the computer. It's just a lot of information. You're the user of the
computer. Yes.
Yeah.
Now, who's the user? Who's the user of the brain? And the answer is the brain. The brain consciousness is the brain's user illusion of itself. That's what consciousness is. It's a user illusion that is designed by evolution and by learning and by cultural evolution to make our brains
useful,
capable,
in a sense,
of getting our bodies through this complicated world.
Yes, see, at that point, I have to say that what you call an illusion is, to me, the most important thing there is.
The idea that all this consciousness is an illusion created by the brain goes by different names, such as physicalism or reductive materialism. But at its core is the idea that there is no immaterial you experiencing consciousness. There is in the end just physical processes in the brain. There's no need for a spiritual, immaterial soul, and consequently certainly no need for God. And it's not just Dennett who has popularised this view. For many decades, a materialist account of the mind has been an assumed fact among the world's most popular thinkers.
Now, that sense of being a subject, a locus of consciousness inside the head, is an illusion. That is, it makes no neuroanatomical sense. There's no place in the brain for your ego to be hiding. We know that all of these things are delivered by myriad different processes in the brain that are spread out over the whole of the brain. This self is just this kind of center of experience.
We feel as though it's me having the stream of experiences. Right. Well, where is that thing? Look inside the brain. You don't find anywhere for it to be. You don't find jobs for it to do because all the jobs are being done by bits of the brain. So there's something wrong with that, isn't there?
My own feeling is when we understand the brain better, that question will evaporate. We'll look at the brain with our newfound understanding, maybe it's 100 years in the making, maybe 1,000 years in the making, and we'll say, aha, when electrons and quarks and protons move in this particular configuration, one of the byproducts is an inner sensation that we call conscious experience.
Academics like Sam Harris, Susan Blackmore and Brian Greene represent the long-standing status quo on mind and brain. And there's no doubt that the human brain is an extraordinary organ. It contains 100 billion neurons transmitting electrical signals at up to 250 miles an hour. Its fantastically complex physical structure is gradually being unravelled by modern brain imaging as we see which parts light up when we speak, think, pray, experience joy or sadness, and much more. Dennett specifically championed the idea of consciousness as an emergent property of the brain, that the combination of lots of complex physical activity leads to the experience of consciousness. However, For the last decade or more, David Chalmers, who's Professor of Philosophy and Neural Science at NYU, has been asking some hard questions of his materialist colleagues. Questions prompted by his own long search for a physical explanation of the phenomenon of consciousness.
And for a long time, I banged my head against the wall, looking for a theory of consciousness in purely physical terms that would work. But I eventually came to the conclusion that that just didn't work for systematic reasons. It's a long story, but the core idea is just that what you get from purely reductionist explanations in physical terms, in brain-based terms, is stories about the functioning of a system, its structure, its dynamics, the behavior it produces. Great for solving the easy problems, how we behave, how we function. But when it comes to subjective experience, why does all this feel like something from the inside? That's something fundamentally new, and it's always a further question.
David Chalmers himself coined a term for this question of how the physical activity of our brain can result in the first-person experiences we all have. He called it the hard problem of consciousness. Sharon Dirckx, author of Am I Just My Brain, has a PhD in brain imaging from the University of Cambridge. She told me there are some so-called easy problems around behaviour and mental states that brain science can be helpful to understand, but Chalmers' hard problem of consciousness remains untouched.
Whenever we hear about a new breakthrough in this area of consciousness go out into a scientific journal or into the media, it gives the appearance of having kind of cracked this problem and solved it. But often what they're presenting is they've solved another easy problem. So they've looked at what's going on in the brain when you move from one state of consciousness to another, such as going from being awake to being asleep, or from being awake to being under the influence of anesthetic, or so on. These would be considered altered states of consciousness. And you're looking at the brain networks that are switched on and off when you move from one to the other. And that's an example of an easy problem, which of course is not easy. And whole lifetimes of research are taken up in studying these phenomena. But Chalmers makes the point that compared to the hard problem, they're trivial. The hard problem is trying to crack how on earth do you get from non-conscious neurons to what it is like to be you. And he describes that as the hard problem of consciousness.
You don't even have to examine a brain scan to grasp this so-called hard problem. There are various thought experiments that have been proposed to show why our conscious experience cannot be identical with the physical working of the brain. Mary's Room, a famous thought experiment by philosopher Frank Jackson, asks us to imagine a woman called Mary, who's an expert in neuroscience and brain chemistry and understands everything there is to know about the physical activity that accompanies the sensation of seeing colour. However, Mary lives in a completely black and white house, dresses in black and white clothes, etc. She has never seen a colour. Then, one day, an image of a red apple appears on her screen. She sees the colour red for the first time. The question is, has Mary learned something new? Well, of course she has. And you could multiply the examples. Could the smell of freshly brewed coffee be described through a comprehensive knowledge of the way the chemicals from the brewing process interact with our brain synapses? Of course, again, the answer is no. It seems evident then that these experiences, qualia in philosophical jargon, are qualitatively different to the physical brain processes that accompany them. While our conscious experiences are clearly connected to brain activity, they're also clearly not the same thing as the brain activity itself.
So the science is showing that mind and brain are correlated. They are very closely connected. But just because they are connected does not necessarily mean that one causes the other or that they are synonymous. And someone like Wilder Penfield actually brought quite a lot of insight into this area. So he is someone that was known for developing methods to treat epilepsy. He founded the Montreal Neurological Institute and was a real a pioneer in his field. What they did to try and treat epilepsy was stimulate the cortex of awake patients. You know, there are no pain receptors on the surface of your brain, and so you can stimulate areas of the brain, and the patient will tell you what's happening to them while you do that. And because of this, he was able to develop his model of the surface of the cortex and the different regions that each part of the cortex corresponded to. But he noticed during the process of his research that he was never able to do two things. He was never able to force someone to make a decision, and he was never able to force them to have a sense of self. Those two things it seemed to evade his research. Of course, there were areas that generated certain types of qualia, but not the ones that are most kind of fundamental to our sense of having an agency in the world. He wasn't able to generate that or cause it in his studies. And so even though these two things, mind and brain, experience and process, are integrated and correlated, they are not synonymous. The brain can be objectively measured. The mind is very subjective. If we want to know what it's like for you to go through this day, we could measure stuff from your brain, but to access what's in your mind, we need to ask you. It's a very different thing. And so there are many philosophers and agnostics and atheists, as well as Christians, that agree that mind and brain are two very different things. And so the view that you are your brain doesn't really seem to be good enough to explain human beings.
As we heard earlier, the 25-year-old bet that Chalmers won against his physicalist friend Christoph Koch shows that the hard problem of consciousness has simply not been cracked by advances in our understanding of the brain. And that's why a new theory of consciousness, proposed by Chalmers and an increasing number of secular thinkers, has been gaining ground.
The first crazy idea is that consciousness is fundamental. Physicists sometimes take some aspects of the universe as fundamental building blocks: space and time and mass. If you can't explain consciousness in terms of the existing fundamentals, space, time, mass, charge, then as a matter of logic, you need to expand the list. The natural thing to do is to postulate consciousness itself as something fundamental, a fundamental building block of nature. This doesn't mean you suddenly can't do science with it. This opens up the way for you to do science with it. What we then need is to study the fundamental laws governing consciousness, the laws that connect consciousness to other fundamentals: space, time, mass, physical processes. Physicists sometimes say that we want fundamental laws so simple that we could write them on the front of a t-shirt. Well, I think something like that is the situation we're in with consciousness. We want to find fundamental laws so simple we could write them on the front of a t-shirt. We don't know what those laws are yet, but that's what we're after. The second crazy idea is that consciousness might be universal. Every system might have some degree of consciousness.
The view that Chalmers is proposing is called panpsychism. So what is that exactly?
Panpsychism is the view that consciousness goes all the way down to the fundamental building blocks of the physical universe.
This is Philip Goff, a philosopher at Durham University and a leading proponent of panpsychism.
It doesn't necessarily mean everything is conscious. The basic commitment is that, as I say, the basic building blocks of physical reality, maybe fundamental particles like electrons and quarks, have incredibly simple forms of conscious experience, and then that the very complex experience of the human or animal brain is somehow built up from these simpler forms of consciousness at the level of fundamental physics. So panpsychists might not think this table is conscious, but they may very well think the smallest particles it's made up of have some kind of very simple conscious experience.
Goff explained to me where panpsychism fits in alongside the other typical theories of consciousness.
But I think too often people think, oh, it's just another scientific problem. We just need to do a few more experiments and we'll crack it. What I'm most passionate about more than anything is that this is fundamentally a philosophical problem. The ancient challenge, which is traditionally referred to as the mind-body problem. How does consciousness and the physical world fit together? And there are a few different options. Maybe the physical world is fundamental and consciousness emerges from physical processes in the brain. That's the physicalist or materialist position. The panpsychist thinks it goes the other way around. No, it's consciousness that's fundamental and physical reality emerges from underlying facts about consciousness, so they turn physicalism upside down. Thirdly, we have the dualist position that both consciousness and the physical universe are fundamental but radically different, two radically different kinds of stuff. Now, crucially, each of these views is empirically equivalent. That is to say, you can't do an experiment to work out which is right. For any scientific data, each of these views will just interpret that data on their own terms. So this makes people very nervous. If you can't do an experiment, how do you answer this? I think, we need to rediscover the importance of philosophy and the role that has to play in finding out about the nature of reality, particularly when it comes to consciousness.
In her book, Am I Just My Brain?, Sharon Dirckx helpfully examines the different theories on offer, including the view shared by Philip Goff and David Chalmers.
So panpsychism assumes that there are elements of consciousness in every living thing, right down to the atomic scale as well. And someone like Philip Goff would say there are even unimaginably simple forms of consciousness, even at the atomic scale. And this is a fascinating view. In a sense, it kind of solves the hard problem by actually making consciousness fundamental. I guess it doesn't quite explain the very different levels of consciousness that you would see in Homo sapiens as compared with even the most advanced primate. And it doesn't quite explain what philosophers refer to as the unity of consciousness. If there are conscious properties even at the atomic scale, then why is it that we only have one unified integrated conscious experience? Why don't we have like trillions and trillions of independent ones? So that's one position. I guess another position would be what's known as substance dualism. And this view would say that there isn't just one substance that gives rise to everything. There are actually two. There's the physical brain, and then the mind is a non-physical entity of its own. And these two things interact very closely, but they are distinct. And the brain, the mind can exist independently of the brain if it needs to. And this is obviously a view that's mostly held by theists. But some very influential philosophers like Richard Swinburne, Keith Ward, Alvin Plantinga, and so on would all adhere to a view of substance dualism to explain the mind. I guess the challenge of this view is, well, how exactly does a non-physical mind interact with a physical brain, and how do we marry that with the sciences that seem to be showing us that these two things work very, they seem to be the same thing. When you look at someone's brain, they seem to be the same. So how is it that part of it is non-physical? And those are the different views. Every view has its challenges.
As Sharon says, substance dualism is a long-standing view among theists who believe in the soul. It's arguably not as trendy right now as panpsychism, but its defenders, such as philosopher J.P. Moreland, speaking here on the Adherent Apologetics channel, say it makes best sense of our experience of ourselves and the world.
I'm what's called a property or conscious dualist, because that means I think consciousness is immaterial, not physical. because there are things true of it that isn't true of anything physical, so they can't be the same thing, however much they depend on one another. And then I believe that there has to be a simple soul. Now, what I mean by a soul is a spiritual or immaterial substance or thing that has and unifies consciousness and animates the body. Let me say it again. A soul is an immaterial or spiritual substance or thing that has and unifies consciousness and animates the body.
In their writing, philosophers such as J.P. Moreland and Richard Swinburne have used various aspects of what we now know about brains, personhood, and even research into near-death experiences to show that there are many reasons to believe that our conscious experience could exist independently of any physical body or brain, that we have a soul. Whatever you make of these various theories, what strikes me is that regardless of the solution to the mind-brain problem, it's clear that the reductive materialism favoured by so many biologists and atheist thinkers is no longer the only game in town, at least in philosophical circles. But what about the scientists? Sharon Dirckx herself was an atheist when she began studying science as a student. However, during the course of her studies and engaging with Christian thinkers, she came to realise that science does not exclude God, as she had once thought, leading her on a journey to Christian faith. I asked her how her newfound faith stacked up against the views of her colleagues as she pursued her PhD in brain imaging.
Whenever I get asked this question, I find myself reflecting that when I was engaged in the sciences, both as a not yet Christian and then later on as a Christian, actually, we were not thinking philosophically about the science. We were simply studying the phenomena that we wanted to study. Maybe there was an unspoken assumption that because the bread and butter of a scientist is physics and chemistry and processes, that maybe there were some that assumed that because that's my daily bread and butter, that must be all that there is. And there were philosophical conversations that took place over lunchtimes, but they weren't around the science. They weren't kind of analysing what we were doing and what was the best philosophical basis. It was about, is there a God? Who is Jesus? What on earth do Christians, who do they think they are? That sort of thing. Fascinating 2-hour lunch breaks as a PhD student. But it wasn't about science. And that's an observation for me that I've reflected on, that a lot of scientists are not taught to think philosophically about what is the best philosophical basis for what they're even doing. What's the most persuasive explanation for the existence of the very mind that they use to engage in their science? Many scientists are not thinking in that way, and they don't even realise that nobody is neutral. Everyone brings a worldview to their science. But I wasn't taught to think that way, and I don't think my friends and colleagues were either.
I think Sharon identifies that for many secular scientists, whether articulated explicitly or not, there is a presumption of naturalism. Back in episode 19, when discussing biologist Richard Dawkins' central argument against God, his naturalistic assumptions about reality were at the core of his claim that God must be even more complex and thereby even more improbable than the universe that he's supposed to explain.
How can you possibly say that such an entity is a single, simple entity?
But one of the major flaws of Dawkins' argument is that it appears to be circular. Dawkins starts out by assuming reductive materialism, which, if true, would already rule out the very thing that he's supposed to be trying to argue against, an unembodied, that is to say, immaterial, and thereby ultimately simple, divine mind.
My view would be a materialistic one. There has to be some sort of physical medium, doubtless highly complicated, which results in the phenomena which we colloquially give names like mind and even soul too. So I don't think that the mind is an immaterial thing that has any existence outside the material world.
But as many critics, including philosopher William Lane Craig, have pointed out, Dawkins can't just assume this materialism by default. He needs to justify it.
If you don't believe in the possibility of an immaterial self or mind, then you don't need this kind of argument to prove atheism. You just say there cannot be such a thing as God because there cannot be minds distinct from physical organisms or brains. That should have been his argument. And that would then lead us into questions about mind, brain, identity, and is the mind reducible to the brain processes? And that's another large question that one might discuss.
In contrast to Dawkins' reductionist explanation of the mind, as we've already seen, these are not simply scientific questions. In fact, I believe that many secular thinkers and philosophers are persuasively showing that materialism cannot be the de facto explanation of reality. Philip Goff told me of how he has seen his own panpsychist view growing in popularity in academic circles in recent years.
I'm glad I was born when I was in terms of philosophy. I think 50 years ago you couldn't publish something on the kind of views I now defend. I mean, actually, when I first started looking for academic jobs, some well-meaning professor said to me, maybe don't talk about that panpsychism stuff, and now it's very much taken serious. I have graduate students coming from all over the world to work with me on panpsychism. So yeah, and look, I think if you take a little bit of a broader perspective, our thinking as a society on consciousness has changed very rapidly. For much of the 20th century, people dealt with consciousness by pretending it didn't exist. We had the behaviorist movement who said, the only serious subject matter for science of the mind is behavior, because it's behavior you can observe and quantify and measure. From the 1990s, I'd say, we start to get that taboo going, and consciousness has then become a respectable focus for science. But still, for too long, people thought, it's just an issue for neuroscience. As I say, what people are now seeing, I think, is the philosophical underpinnings of the problem. That this is something that was baked into how we designed science 400 years ago. And hence, if we're going to deal with it, we need to fundamentally rethink our current scientific paradigm. So I think that's part of it. But also, I suppose, just that the more traditional options perhaps haven't borne fruit, that these challenges haven't been dealt with. Maybe I could share something with you that might be of interest. I think, in my experience in the public and among scientists working on consciousness, there is an expectation that we will one day explain consciousness, that we will make intelligible the emergence of consciousness from neural processes in the brain in the way we've made intelligible, the emergence of liquidity in terms of underlying chemistry. Whereas in academic philosophy, the vast majority of physicalists have given up on that project. They agree with me, with my side of the debate, that it's not a coherent project. And instead they try to argue for some reason with consciousness, we don't need to do that. We can just posit a kind of brute identity between consciousness and neural processes of a kind we don't find anywhere else in science. And, to my mind, that's kind of giving up. I think if physicalism is true, we ought to expect that we'll be able to give a fully intelligible explanation of how consciousness emerges in the brain. The fact that physicalists in philosophy have given up on that, to my mind, is pretty damning. And if the general public and scientists were more aware that physicalist philosophers have given up on that project of solving the hard problem of consciousness, then I think physicalism might fall in their estimation.
Goff says that scientists are frequently out of step with philosophers today. Yet even in the sciences, especially quantum physics, there's been a recent fascinating overlap between the two. It's been increasingly observed that at the smallest level of fundamental particles, really weird, counterintuitive stuff happens. Light, for instance, can act as both a particle and a wave. Quantum entanglement allows particles on different sides of the galaxy to act in unison, and the list goes on. And on top of all this, there's evidence that observation, i.e. your and my consciousness is somehow integral to making the physics of our universe real. Now, fear not, this is about as complex as today's episode gets, and we'll bring things back to earth after this little excursion into metaphysics. But here's philosopher Keith Ward heroically trying to get our heads around this idea.
What is an electron? Most of you will have done some physics in school anyway, and you will know that an electron, will you know what an electron is? Probably not. Because what we get taught in schools about electrons is they're like little planets which circle in orbits around the nucleus, the center of an atom. So they're like little planets. They're solid things which have a particular place and location and move at a particular speed. But let me tell you, that is false. That is simply not true. That's for school kids. It all goes wrong if you think that the simple things you've been told are the true things. What you've got to see is the simple things are not the true things. They're just ways in which most of us can understand them. But actually a physicist is able to understand electrons much better. And a physicist, I've asked plenty of physicists about this, and they all tell me the same thing. It doesn't make any sense, but here goes. An electron is a probability wave in Hilbert space. What is Hilbert space? Well, it's logical space. It's a space of all logically possible states of affairs. It's not an actual space like this one. But it's a state of possibilities, a space of possibilities. What is a probability wave? Well, you know what a wave is, but a probability wave isn't an actual wave. It's a wave of probability. It's in Hilbert space. It's in conceptual space. And what a probability wave does is it tells you that if you take the square of the amplitude, how big it is that way, if you take the square of the amplitude of a probability wave, you get the probability of finding an electron at a particular location if you carry out a specific experiment. Now, what's the point of all this? The point of all this is to say reality is nothing like any of us can imagine. If you try to say, what is reality really like? It's not made of little hard balls bumping into one another. That's obsolete science. That is absolutely false. Nobody believes that in physics anymore. Those little hard balls have collapsed. They've all gone. They don't bump into each other. So where are they? Well, you can't say. In fact, let me quote John von Neumann, one of the greatest quantum physicists, all elements of reality are elements of consciousness. There's consciousness coming in. So how does that happen? Well, these probability waves in Hilbert space collapse. The wave function collapses into the perception of an object when, and only when, it is observed. Precisely when it's measured, but of course the measurement is ready to be observed at some future time. And there's the intriguing thing about modern physics, that this whole world appears only to be the way it is when we look at it.
This is the surprising turn in modern physics that is the stuff of lots of nerdy memes about whether Schrodinger's cat is alive or dead. Quantum physics is really weird, and physical reality only becomes concrete, as it were, when we observe or measure it. And as William Lane Craig explains, it arguably invites God back into the conversation on science and consciousness in a surprising way.
Science encounters metaphysical problems, which religion can help to solve. A possible example is the so-called measurement problem in quantum physics. According to quantum physics, subatomic particles do not have all of their properties intrinsically, but only in relation to a measuring apparatus. The problem is that the measuring apparatus itself can also be described by quantum physics. But then it too lacks certain properties unless it is related to another measuring apparatus. But that apparatus can also be described by quantum physics, and off we go on a vicious infinite regress. Unless there is some way to break the chain, nothing would possess any of these properties, which is absurd. Now, some physicists have proposed that the chain is broken when the measurement is observed by consciousness. But it seems outrageous to say that the whole universe depends upon human consciousness for its existence. Moreover, human consciousness is linked to a physical substratum, the brain, which can be given a quantum physical description. So the question inevitably arises, who observes the human observers. What is needed here is a sort of transcendent, cosmic observer who observes immediately the result of any quantum measurement situation. But this is, of course, exactly the being in whom the theist believes. And thus, the person who believes in God seems to have the resources needed to resolve the measurement problem plaguing quantum physics.
Okay, back to Earth now. I confess that a lot of this stuff is well beyond my pay grade too. What I can say is that it's evident that the more we know about physics, the more we know about brains, the more we know about the mind, the more we seem to need answers that reach beyond the purely physical. And let's not forget, while the philosophical questions around consciousness may seem complex, the actual experience of it is not. That we are conscious beings is one of the most obvious things we can ever know. Yet it is an aspect of our experience that resolutely refuses to fit into the box of atheist materialism. Perhaps the evidence for God is quite literally staring us in the face. Now, to be clear, many of the proponents of the new wave of thinking on the mind, such as Thomas Nagel, David Chalmers and Philip Goff, even as they reject materialism, they're not necessarily theists. They don't believe in God. But fascinatingly, in his most recent book, Why? The Purpose of the Universe, Philip Goff acknowledges that there are powerful arguments for purpose, design and meaning in the universe. But he advocates for cosmopsychism, that there is an underlying consciousness to the whole universe that may explain why it seems to produce you and me. He says he believes it can offer a kind of middle way between traditional belief in God and secular atheism.
I've just always, not deliberately, but found, well, I have problems with both sides, and the things I find attractive and right about both sides. I mean, one way of seeing the project in my recent book is, I think, the explanatory demands of the theist, like a demand to explain fine-tuning, a demand to explain what is something rather than nothing, are good ones, but I don't see why you have to postulate this all-powerful supernatural being rather than, say, add to the characteristics of the physical universe. So, yeah, so I definitely see my own viewpoint as a kind of middle way there.
As I understand it, Philip, your principal objection to theism is the problem of suffering and evil. I guess I want to know, why doesn't your kind of cosmic conscious universe suffer the same problem? It's pointing everything in the direction of us, but that means it's pointing us in the direction of a lot of pain and suffering as well. So what's the difference?
I have two problems with the God hypothesis. The one that's less serious for me is the point about parsimony. Why postulate something outside of the universe when physics doesn't tell us what the universe is anyway? So it's a theoretical option to suppose that the cosmic designer, if you like, or the teleological goal-directed entity is just the universe itself. So that's one point. I'd need a reason to go outside of the universe. But the more fundamental thing is, I've always found the problem of evil incredibly compelling since I decided not to get confirmed Catholic when I was 14, upset my grandmother. The challenge of reconciling a loving God with the terrible suffering we find in the universe. So it's a great question. Why did the cosmic goal-directedness create us then? There's still so much suffering. I mean, I guess the key would be, insofar as I'm thinking about the source of cosmic purpose as a kind of mind, which, as I say, is not something I'm necessarily tied to, but I am open to it being a kind of mind. But insofar as I am open to that, it's going to be a mind with limited abilities. So why think if there is a fundamental mind, it's all powerful, right? And so it's not that there's something outside of the universe that's constraining it. It's just the universe is able to do some things, isn't able to do others, and has done the best it can in those constrained circumstances. To my mind, that the universe as we find it is a mix of accident and design. Some things seem too improbable to be chance, like the fine-tuning. Some other stuff about consciousness I explore as well. But some stuff seems arbitrary, gratuitous, and, to my mind, both theists and atheists are ignoring one side of that equation. I think, well, let's try and have a hypothesis that accounts for both of those. And the idea of a fundamental mind that is good, but it has limited abilities, seems to me to quite elegantly account for all the data.
Unfortunately, questions of the brain, mind and suffering became very real for Philip Goff since the time of our recording, after he hit his head in a fall and suffered a brain bleed. Happily, he is on the mend, and we wish him a speedy recovery. But I do find Goff's take a fascinating one. I asked Sharon Dirckx what she thinks of Goff's idea of cosmic panpsychism as an alternative to a personal God.
Yeah, I guess then you come to the kind of, the kind of reasoning that kind of inspired even the kind of scientists in the modern scientific revolution, and why different worldviews, pantheism being, and I'm not saying that's the same as panpsychism, but the view that there is a kind of global consciousness out there, why that didn't give rise to the study of nature. And I think one of the reasons is that there's something about the personhood of God, choosing to create and choosing to make things a certain way, that actually is another layer within that. I do think the panpsychist view is a really helpful view to have on the table at this point in the conversation, because it emphasizes the importance of having an argument that has explanatory power to explain the conscious self, that physicalist approaches are not doing. But I still think that the most persuasive argument is for Christian theism, that there's a personal God that chose to make the world a certain way and chose to make human beings in his image, that arguably has more explanatory power.
The subject of whether we need more than just a physical account of reality came up prominently in the recent Dissidents Dialogue, chaired by Freddie Sayers of Unheard, between Richard Dawkins and Ayaan Hirsi Ali, the former New Atheist whose embrace of Christianity has been referenced several times already in this series.
As human beings, we are material, yes, but we also are more than material. We have a sense of consciousness, and we have a range of needs. And some of these needs, reason can answer, and pure science can answer. But some of these needs cannot be answered by that. And I think faith in a higher power, in God, and in the story that makes sense of it all, gives it meaning. I think Christianity does offer a recipe, and perhaps, in my view, the best recipe for not only how to live with yourself and connect to the universe, but also how to connect with fellow human beings, and then bring about a civilization like this one.
Suppose it were true that atheism doesn't offer anything. Suppose it doesn't offer anything. So what? Why should it offer anything? Why should the universe offer you anything?
But what is the scientific explanation for you being moved to tears by Sir Matthew's passion?
Well, it's neurology.
It's neurology. At one level, that is a perfectly good scientific explanation, but it is certainly not a full explanation. And it's why I believe Ayaan, in her conversion to Christianity, seems open to engaging life at a different level now, one that includes the whole range of ways in which we can perceive truth, beauty and purpose. We are more than just our brain. And as we're about to hear, even the brain itself, when working in proper harmony, agrees. Thanks to Gareth, who wrote in to say, whether you're a person of faith, agnostic, atheist, or none of the above, this series is both genuinely thought-provoking and inspiring. I could not recommend it highly enough. Leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts, or simply posting about us on your social media helps others to discover the show. If you want to follow more of my work, why not get my fortnightly newsletter? I'll even send you the first chapter of The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God book for free when you subscribe. And if you'd like to support the show, you can get early access episodes and bonus content. Gold supporters will receive signed copies of both my books. For the newsletter and to support, visit justinbrierley.com or the links with today's show.
You know, if you ask people in this country, it's different in America, I know, but in this country, do you follow a religion? I think about 11 or 12% say yes. But if you ask people, do you think there's more to the cosmos than is contained within the reductionist materialist position, about 95% of them say yes. So it's that I feel is there. And everywhere I go, I find that young people are very receptive to these ideas. And as I think Niels Bohr, was it, or Max Planck said, that science moves forward a funeral by funeral.
One funeral at a time,
yes.
Yeah.
This is psychiatrist and philosopher Iain McGilchrist, whose own research on the brain was the focus of a live big conversation event I hosted for Premier Unbelievable 2 years ago.
If matter is, and it's a big if matter really has no consciousness in it, then you can't make the step from that to consciousness. Many philosophers have tried, nobody has succeeded.
Well, one of the first big conversations I had on this was with Daniel Dennett, opposite Keith Ward, discussing these kinds of issues. Daniel Dennett, as I'm sure you're familiar, is, takes this view that actually it is a purely material phenomenon. Yep. And that essentially consciousness arises out of very complex chemical, physical interactions. His reasoning, I would assume, would go along the lines of, well, we don't have any evidence that anything else is going on than physical stuff, because that's what we see when we measure it and look at it and do the MRI scans. Why would we assume that there is some other thing we call consciousness coming in from the outside, either being transmitted or permitted? What's your perspective on that?
Well, it's a very basic and well-known point that not everything that matters is matter and is measurable. Love, where do you measure that? How do you do it? The meaning of music, in what lab is he going to find that? Does he deny that music has meaning? I don't know. But I think his position is wholly incoherent. He says that consciousness is an illusion, but I would point out that for it to be an illusion, there must be a consciousness to be eluded. And so it's one of the most remarkable statements by an obviously rather intelligent man.
It was a fascinating evening of dialogue that included Sharon Dirckx too, and in which McGilchrist went on record with his support of a panpsychist view of consciousness. There's a link to it with the show notes. In the 2 years since I hosted the conversation, Iain McGilchrist's star has only continued to rise. McGilchrist is an Oxford Don who has been researching psychiatry and brain science for decades, studying the nature of the human brain and the illnesses that can affect it. However, before turning to medicine, his interests lay in literature, philosophy and theology. Consequently, his wide perspective on science and culture has led him to diagnose a far more serious problem in the world. His massively influential book, The Master and His Emissary, outlined his thesis that the two hemispheres of the human brain are no longer cooperating as they once did. McGilchrist refers to the right hemisphere as the master and the left hemisphere as his emissary. They are not equal partners. The left brain is supposed to serve the right brain by doing computation of the individual pieces of data it's gathered. The right brain then fits this information into a larger sphere of sense-making. For millennia, we've been guided by the harmony of this relationship, with the right brain taking precedence. However, McGilchrist's thesis is that in the last few centuries, this cooperative relationship has become inverted. Now, left-brain thinking rules a culture in which the world can be explained mechanistically, and where the role of intuition and imagination has been sidelined. 2 years on from our first encounter, I sat down again with McGilchrist along with Belle Tyndall for a re-enchanting conversation on what this all means for the direction of our culture.
I'd be interested to hear a general picture of how that's manifested in our culture. You frequently talk about left hemispheric versus right hemispheric ways of seeing the world, essentially. And you've spoken at length and written at length about the way that a left hemispheric view of looking at reality has come to dominate in academic circles, science, popular thinkers of our day, the new atheists and so on, who want to kind of boil everything down to a kind of purely material explanations of things. it's a big question, but why has our culture pushed in that direction, given that there is meant to be this proper relationship between the two hemispheres?
There are a number of reasons why I think that has happened. I think it's happened in our contemporary culture since about the time of the Enlightenment, which was a great movement, but it unfortunately was also a hubristic movement. In other words, it thought in an arrogant way that it could control and understand everything, and that all true ideas could be formulated in simple sentences, that they could be communicated to another person directly using that language, and that they would all cohere, they wouldn't contradict one another. But unfortunately, reality is more complex than that. I think what happens is in the new introduction, the one I wrote in 2019 for the 10-year anniversary of the Master and His Emissary, I think I give about 6 or 7 reasons why this tends to happen. But one is that the left hemisphere is the one that enables us to grasp and get stuff. That is, in fact, how it evolved and why it evolved. It evolved in order to enable us rapidly and efficiently to pick something up, usually to eat it, and eventually to be able to use tools. But in other words, to manipulate the world and to apprehend it, to grasp onto it. Whereas the right hemisphere is holding the rest of the picture together so that we don't just apprehend the world, but comprehend, to hold it together. And that's a quite different task, if you like. But when a society gets very large, a number of things happen. First of all, it's harder for people to know one another, to know that they can trust one another, and so forth. So things have to become done at a distance. They have to become more theoretical. The very fact that there is a growth of something like an empire means that governing it requires again, a process that can be, as we would now say, rolled out. So beforehand, there have to be bureaucratic procedures that are approved, that will enable something to happen in the colonies and so forth. And so what you get is a very crude, simple control mechanism that takes over from the full complexity of life. And you see it in the art and the architecture and the poetry and the music, and you see it in the way in which people think. So, I mean, I've had to gloss over a huge amount there, and people will say, how does he see that? But my only answer to that is, well, I do go into it at some length in my writing. But I think it's because it aids the one in us which wants simple answers that will enable us to be powerful. It's power that is the main, what shall I say, the goal, the value that excites and motivates the left hemisphere. That is its purpose, its raison d'etre, is to give us power. It's the one that controls our right hand, with which we do the grasping and the grabbing. Whereas the right hemisphere is doing the far more difficult task of holding together a very complex and rich picture. If you like, the left hemisphere is like a map. It has a very simplified diagram, a theory about what's going on. I think the rise of theories about what's going on that are uncorrected by looking around you and saying, is that at all probable, is one of the things that we're experiencing right now. There are some really quite extraordinary theoretical assumptions being made that would have appeared and will appear if we have a future, again, completely absurd. But they arise out of a theoretical construction, not out of a real and true lived understanding of what it is to be human.
I've heard a lot of people talking and yourself referencing various types of crises that seem to be affecting culture at the moment, Iain. And you could name, for instance, the meta crisis, a sort of sense that there's lots of different factors, technological, ecological, social, that are coming together to kind of create a sort of almost semi-apocalyptic vision of the future and what it may hold and so on. There's this meaning crisis that many psychologists are talking about, the fact that many people don't seem to have a story to make sense of their lives any longer. And then you've got the mental health crisis, you know, the apparent sudden rise in problems among young people especially, and so on. I'm sure they're all interlinked. Again, big question, but the left hemispheric domination that you've been talking about, how does that play into these specific various crises that we're now sort of seem to be having to try to find solutions to, especially here in the West?
Well, as you rightly say, Justin, they're interconnected. And I suppose the umbrella term is the meta-crisis. And how I see that is that when you have a sort of fundamentalist scientific view that everything can be explained by science, various things happen. You rule out of existence, and certainly out of examination, all those things that can't actually be measured and reproduced and manipulated in the laboratory. And these turn out to be the things that most matter to us and give our lives meaning. And they include the creative arts, they include a sense of the sacred and of the divine, they include the ability to appreciate and understand nature, and they include things like empathy and compassion. Now, these things are very hard they can't be seen, they can't be measured on a scope of some kind. People sometimes say, oh, well, you can scan the brain and so on, but these people usually know very little about brain scanning, because nobody who's up on that would ever say what you're measuring is any of those abstract and rather wonderful things. You're measuring proxies in terms of chemicals or blood flow, which are extremely crude and are not necessarily measuring what you think they're measuring at all. There are enormous pitfalls in that view. So a world in which we have excluded from our view the things that make the world mean something for us is bound to lead to a situation in which there's a so-called crisis of meaning. And I sometimes refer to the three things that seem most important for human flourishing: mental flourishing, physical flourishing, and societal flourishing. And these are our relationships with one another in a community where we trust one another, we think we share values, we share our lives, we share our meals, we share our worship. The second is the relationship with nature, which used to be something that inevitably people were very close to. I mean, until a couple of hundred years ago, 99.9% of the world's population lived necessarily in very close proximity to nature. Now it might be less than half. And the third is the realm of the sacred or the divine. And to have lost this is a catastrophe, because we know, I mean, even for just venal and utilitarian calculus, having such a relationship with the divine seems to be the most potent indicator of psychological health, emotional health, mental health, and physical health, unbelievably. But all these things go together, of course. They're all aspects of one another. And so if you really wanted to make people feel completely at sea, and as though they had no rudder and no compass, you would take away those things that are the very lodestones of life. So that's, I think, where the meaning crisis comes from. And I think I've already touched on why this is a mental health crisis. People feel lonely on a scale that is never been seen before. And tragically, most young people feel that 85% of them feel that life is pointless and meaningless. So we really have a vast crisis here, a meta-crisis that involves a meaning crisis and leads to a mental health crisis.
Iain McGilchrist was raised, like many of his peers, in a Christian culture, and at a young age even considered becoming a monk. However, he now claims no particular religious affiliation. Yet his theory about the brain's influence on our modern world has attracted admirers from both the religious and the secular world. When The Master and His Emissary was published, it gained glowing endorsements from voices as diverse as atheist philosopher A.C. Grayling, secular novelist Philip Pullman, comedian John Cleese, and then Archbishop of Canterbury Rowan Williams. A book that traverses the religious-secular divide is worth taking notice of, and is one of the reasons why McGilchrist strikes me as another bellwether of the new intellectual attitude towards faith emerging in our culture. In his most recent 2-volume work, The Matter with Things, and not a short read at more than 3,000 pages, McGilchrist tackles the God question head-on in the final chapter, titled The Sense of the Sacred. When we first met, the book had only just been published, and knowing how much baggage is associated with religion, McGilchrist was nervous about including a chapter that argues for a divine source underlying our mind and the cosmos.
And that chapter alone is a small book, over 100 pages long. And it was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. And many of my colleagues, philosophers who read what I wrote, begged me not to include it, because they said, the philosophy is great, but people will just dismiss you. So far they haven't, so that's on the good side. But it seemed to me quite wrong. If I left that out, that was really, in some ways, the most important thing I had to say about anything. And I knew before I started that any language was going to betray me. The Tao, that is the real Tao, cannot be named. That's the opening of the Tao Te Ching. For Christians, St. Augustine, si comprehendis, non est Deus. If you understand God, it's not God you've understood, which actually makes an interesting parallel with Richard Feynman, the quantum physicist, who said if you understand quantum physics, you don't understand quantum physics. Yeah. So that was the difficulty, but you're asking me to say where I've landed over a lifetime. I certainly feel strongly that there is something very powerful, of ultimate importance, of great beauty and the source of life and creativity, which is behind this cosmos, that is expressed in its richness, complexity, and responsiveness, because I believe the cosmos is conscious, and I believe, in short, it sounds very odd to say it very boldly and cheaply and quickly, but I think that it's perfectly coherent that the whole cosmos is conscious. And my view is that of a panentheist. So pantheism is the belief that all things are God, and that God is all things. But panentheism is really importantly different. That little syllable N in the middle means in. So God is in all things, and all things are in God. But neither of these things exhausts God, if you see what I mean. So God is bigger, greater than anything we can say or conceive. But there is no divorce between God and any part of what we find ourselves experiencing.
In our recent conversation, I wanted to dig further into McGilchrist's personal story and his thoughts about how, through attending again to right hemispheric ways of thinking, such as prayer, worship, religious community and ritual, we may be able to help our culture through its current meta-crisis.
The first thing is to realize what it is that has been lost from our world. And that's a difficult thing to be aware of. Your culture stops you seeing what it is that very culture stops you from seeing. And one answer to that is a humanistic education that introduces you to the great minds of the past, who can hardly be dismissed, people of astonishing intelligence and learning, who nonetheless were able to see things that we no longer see. And this also includes the Romantics, which I think is an easier path for many people than the expressly religious path, because the defenses go up as soon as the God word is mentioned, which is why when I talk about the sense of the sacred in that chapter, I do move towards talk of God, but I say, but how many misconceptions are wrapped up in that name? It can be for many people a stumbling block, because they don't understand what it is that's being referred to and indicated. And I think that the church can and must, of course, bear much responsibility for this, for projecting for a long time the picture of God as a sort of a superhuman engineer, or even worse, a kind of wrathful, almost psychopathic ruler who will not take any offense. And I think these are problems for people entering into an understanding of that world. And what I tried to do in the matter of things was to, by going through neuroscience and then through philosophical discussion of the various ways in which we can come to understand the world, and these very much include reason and science, things that have served me very well, but they do also include intuition and imagination, which can reveal things that reason and science can't. they can be mistaken, but so can reason and so can science. In fact, one way of describing science is the study of the perpetually mistaken, because, of course, science is always evolving. But our thinking should always be evolving, and we need these other faculties. So I've taken people by the hand in walking through the book and said, do you see why I would say this? Can you see what is meant here? And then I take them through looking at the coincidence of opposites, the relationship between the one and the many, through time, through flow, through space and matter and consciousness, and through values, and even a sense of purpose I dare to treat. And by the time people have read that, I'm hoping that it won't seem so bizarre to think about the possibility that there's something in this idea of the sacred. And what really has moved me is I get many, many, many letters, and I hope they will carry on coming, because I value them so much. But I really do feel humbled by the fact that somebody like me, who doesn't really know how to describe myself in religious terms, have brought people to an understanding. So people write to me saying, I was always a completely confirmed atheist, but after reading your book, I'm persuaded that I really need to take the idea of a divinity more seriously. And that's rather wonderful, because, I didn't anticipate it, but there it is.
I don't think you call yourself a Christian necessarily, but I think so much of what you say sort of dovetails remarkably well with the Christian story. I suppose I'd like to ask, if it's not too impertinent, why you don't find yourself able to necessarily call yourself a Christian, or embrace the Christian story in that sense.
Yes, well, it's hardly surprising that I seem to be Christian, because I have found, of all the religious traditions that I know anything, first of all, I know the Christian tradition best, but I've also found that it speaks to me more than any other tradition, and seems to me deeper and more complex and richer than any other pathway to the divine and sacred that I know. So a lot of people would say, well, that makes you a Christian. And maybe I'm just trained to doubt myself, and trained to doubt any statement of certainty. But it seems to me that the end of wisdom is to reach a point where you say, what do I know? This point was reached by Socrates, by the Buddha, by Confucius, by St. Paul, by many great people who'd spent. Montaigne at the end of his life, what do I know? And I feel in that position that I belong closer to what do I know than I do to the Christian thing. But I think the problem is only that when I'm presented with either a view that Christianity is exclusively right, and that other traditions don't have their wisdom and their value, and when I'm asked to, it of course depends what you mean by believe in certain things. I talk about the nature of belief in my writing, and I don't think it necessarily means a literalistic belief, though I think, as far as I'm concerned, when you're in the realm of talking about God, then who are we, as it were, to say what cannot literally happen? But it doesn't bother me to think of it in terms of a myth or metaphors, which doesn't mean to say it's untrue, because these are the ways in which we discover truth. There is nothing more powerful than the Christian myth, and I use the word myth in its classical sense of mythos, which has no element of suggestion of it being untrue, just that it is actually a kind of truth that is bigger than logos. And, in ancient Greece, muthos, from which we get the word myth, was considered greater than logos, from which we get logic. So the sort of truth in logos was a kind of everyday truth in which you argue in a court of law that somebody owes somebody a sum of money. But mythos was the way in which we image to ourselves through stories, through narratives and images and so on, something that simply escapes everyday language. And so, as far as I'm concerned, everything is metaphorical. I hate to tell the Dawkinses and Dennets of this world that they can't do philosophy or science without metaphors. Everything boils down to metaphors in the end. Metaphors is how we understand everything. So you cannot say there is a final truth there. What you're saying is this metaphor in which I'm bringing together this and that is the closest that I can get to revealing the truth. And I don't think that Christianity, in my experience, is going to ever offer me a comfortable bed of certainty. Faith would not be faith if it was simply a set of facts discovered by science. Faith is from a root meaning fidelity. In other words, of being faithful to something that you believe in the sense that you believe in the person that you have learnt most from, or the person who is most valuable to you. And I certainly believe in God. I believe in Christ, if it is in those terms. If you ask me to sign the fine print about what a camera would have shown if it was outside the sepulchre, I really don't know. And I can't deny that there's a possibility that a body walked forth. I really can't. And I can't be absolutely certain of that either. So for these sort of reasons, I say I'm not sure I'm a Christian. But I suspect that what you would say is that if you raise the bar so high, you'll find that very few people could really call themselves.
Well, I was going to say something similar. You know, I think most people, even people who are happy to call themselves Christians, exist somewhere on that spectrum of faith and doubt, and, you know, uncertainty is part and parcel of it. I mean, when you leave the study and the books and, you know, the neuroscience behind and perhaps just attend a church service, do you feel like you can engage in that sense at some different level?
Absolutely, I do. And I was very fortunate where I was brought up in the south of England to be able to go to a cathedral and also to a chapel every day if I wanted, where there was wonderful music and readings from Holy Writ and very beautiful prayers that, you know, I can still recite by heart because they've gone into my psyche. And I still pray them. When I do go to a holy service, it moves me profoundly. And I can tell you the most profoundly moving services I have been to. One was in Assisi, and another was in Soviet Russia when I went to St. Petersburg, then Leningrad. And I went to a mid-morning service at a Russian Orthodox cathedral. And I was completely transported by it. And I thought, what is being expressed here cannot be expressed better than it is here, as the beautiful and the holy and the true. And it was intensified for me by the fact that the people who were there had all made sacrifices to be there, because as they came and went from the cathedral, there were leather-jacketed thugs with sunglasses on photographing them all, so that they could make sure that their children wouldn't get to university and so forth. I mean, now things are somewhat different in that respect, but I have been deeply moved by occasions of worship in different contexts, mainly in monasteries actually, but in many churches and cathedrals. What I suppose people would say is, you know, am I a cultural Christian? That's a rather a put down, I think. I think it goes a bit further than that. I hope it does. I hope that it, in some ways, is part of the fabric of my being. There you have the best answer I can give to whether I'm a Christian or not.
I so enjoyed this conversation with Iain McGilchrist. You can hear or watch it in full on the Re-Enchanting podcast with myself and Belle Tyndall. There's a link with today's show. Ultimately, Iain McGilchrist, Sharon Dirckx, Philip Goff, you and I are all looking at the same phenomena. A first-person consciousness that seems to defy a purely physical explanation. A universe which, as Philip Goff said earlier, includes both apparent exquisite design and apparent gratuitous suffering. And frequently, within all the joy and pain of life, the opportunity, as Iain McGilchrist has said, to enter into something bigger than ourselves. In the end, I do believe the Christian story provides a better explanation for this big, often messy picture than mere panpsychism. The Bible begins with the story of a God who created the universe out of love and made humans in his own image and called it all good. However, it's also a story that admits of the way the human freedom he gave us has been misused and has sent the whole cosmos out of kilter, meaning that we now live in a beautiful yet broken world. But it also includes the possibility of redemption, renewal and transformation, because the unfathomable mind behind it all chose to become limited, to become knowable in a human person, Jesus, and led the way towards hope and restoration through his death and resurrection. In that sense, I don't only believe the Christian story makes sense of the universe, it makes sense of us, because of the scandalous claim that God became one of us. Now, importantly, McGilchrist's panentheist belief in God isn't necessarily incompatible with Christianity. In fact, I received a scholarly telling off from him for creating a false dichotomy when I suggested it. The Eastern Orthodox tradition has actually always focused on the immanence of a God who is deeply involved in and through his creation. St. Paul himself endorsed a similar description of God by ancient philosophers, saying, "In him we live and move and have our being." That's from Acts 17:28. Yet I do also see a danger of a new openness to a consciousness in the cosmos, leading to an uninspiringly amorphous form of spirituality. C.S. Lewis, responding to the pantheist idea of a God who does nothing and demands nothing, wrote, "It is always shocking to meet life where we thought we were alone. Look out, we cry, it's alive. An impersonal God? Well and good. A subjective God of beauty, truth and goodness inside our own heads? Better still. A formless life force surging through us, a vast power which we can tap? Best of all. But God himself? Alive? Pulling at the other end of the cord? Perhaps approaching at an infinite speed? The hunter, king, husband? That is quite another matter." As I've said before in this podcast series, I believe that the Christian story is only useful if it is true. Like Iain McGilchrist, I agree that the story, the mythos, is incredibly metaphorically powerful. I appreciate Iain's view that we can only speak in metaphors, but I also believe the power of a metaphor is contained in the fact that it ultimately points towards something that exists in reality too. We cannot live on metaphors alone. Poetry, psychology and myth can point us towards God, but can also be employed to keep God at arm's length forever. But God cannot remain a vague cosmic something forever. This must be a God who loves me, who knows me, a God I can approach, that I can know, that I can worship. C.S. Lewis once famously wrote of discovering for himself the mythos who became living fact in the unique and scandalous incarnation of the man Jesus 2,000 years ago. And I believe that today we are seeing more and more people go on a similar, surprising journey of discovering it to be true for themselves.
You know, the culture around us sometimes doesn't like Catholicism. You know when they realize they need us? When their houses are haunted. Try to imagine an Exorcist movie without the Catholic Church. They're like, we've been hearing evil voices from the basement. It's a demon. Somebody call a non-denominational worship leader.
This is stand-up comedian, podcast host and mother of 6, Jen Fulwiler. As you can probably tell, her Catholic faith occasionally features in her stand-up set, but a younger Jen would probably never have recognised her life now.
I'm pretty sure I was an atheist when I was growing up because it's almost like I was wired for it.
This is Jen speaking to Brandon Vaught about her upbringing.
I remember even as a young child, it seems so clear to me that it's not only nonsensical, but dangerous to believe in things that you cannot evaluate, that you cannot find some sort of proof or evidence for. And having grown up in the Bible Belt, obviously I knew a lot of believers, and I saw all these examples of people basically just kind of doing what they wanted to do, but giving it the divine stamp of approval by saying like, oh, Jesus told me to do it. And I thought, this is such nonsense, this is like what, and this is what happens when you believe in something for which there's no proof. You just start like making things up and saying it's from God. And so I was a true atheist materialist in the sense that, I believe that the physical world around us that we can, touch and observe is all there is. There is absolutely nothing else. I didn't believe in spirits or, but I live in Austin, so it's popular to be like spiritual, but not religious. And, there's like earth goddesses or whatever that I was not like that. I believed in nothing except for the material universe.
There was little to shake this confident atheism as Jen grew up. However, meeting her husband, someone with an academic background at universities including Harvard and Stanford, led to some questions.
When I met him, he was kind of a lapsed Christian, a lukewarm believer, and I began to meet all of these friends of his who also had more letters after their name than in their name from these, incredibly prestigious schools. And these were the most reasonable and intelligent people I had ever encountered. And yet most of them believed in God. And I did not think they were right. It was not the case that I thought, oh, here are smart people. They believe in God. They must be right. But in having conversations with them, I was willing to be open to their views because I respected them and I thought they were smart. And in having those conversations, it made me see that you can be reasonable and believe in God. And I was not quite sure how that was possible, but I began to see that it is possible. And I would say that that was the first kind of shift in my worldview.
Speaking on the Journey Home show, Jen explains how she also asked awkward questions of her atheist friends.
It's very slowly over many years, I just began to see that I wasn't finding that truth in atheism. I began to see internal inconsistencies in the atheistic worldview. And we very much prided ourselves on having the lock on intellectual honesty. We're the ones who ask questions. We're the ones who ask all the tough questions. And then I would hang out with a group of atheists and say, well, why do you guys say life has meaning? It seems pretty meaningless to me if we're all just a bunch of randomly evolved series of chemical reactions that are doomed to extinction. And in many cases, of course, not everyone, but in a lot of cases, I kind of got hostility in response to asking those questions. And I would think, wait a minute, I thought we were the ones who could ask all the tough questions. And so I began to see some cracks in my atheistic worldview. And I began to see that we didn't have the lock on intellectual honesty that we said we did.
In the end, it was the experience of having a child that radically shook Jen's worldview. She describes a moment whilst looking at her newborn son in which she had an epiphany.
I was blown away by this experience. I was truly in shock at what this meant. And it was when I looked down at my son, and he was about 2 weeks old, and I did what my dad had always taught me to do, and I thought through what I believed. That was another thing that I think differentiated him from a lot of the lighter ideas about religion, is he would say, before you assent to an idea, before you say that this is true and I believe this, think through all of its conclusions. Don't be one of these people who says you believe some ideology, but you don't really live it. You do it halfway. And so I was looking at my son, and I had all these wonderful feelings about him. And I looked at him and I said, what is he in a strict atheist materialist worldview? And I said, oh, isn't he a precious little randomly evolved set of chemical reactions that is destined to extinction along with the rest of humanity? And as I looked at that, I thought, I do not believe that this is true. And I said, more than anything else in the world, I know with certainty that the love that I feel for this child, that the love that has come into my family since his birth, it comes from something external to us. And that was the first moment that I was no longer an atheist.
Jen has described this moment elsewhere, saying, "I realised if my atheist worldview was true, that all the love I feel for him is all nothing more than chemical reactions in our brains. And I looked down at him and I realised that's not true. That's not the truth."
It was a break with this silly idea that is rampant in our culture of scientism, this idea that if you cannot measure it, if you cannot prove it in a laboratory, then you cannot know that it's true. And in that moment, I thought, no, we believe that things are true all the time that we can't measure or scientifically observe, and love is one of those things. And I thought, I believe in love as an objective reality that is external to the material world, that is external to the chemical reactions that are the conduits in our brain. And so that was the big break for me, realizing, no, I can accept this as true, even if I cannot prove with the scientific method that it's true.
This experience of recognising that love must be more than a feeling generated by brain chemistry led Jen on a search for whether there may be a God behind the mind and the experience of love that she had encountered. She said her first hesitant prayer, asking for help, without being sure at all who was on the other end, and then started looking into books on Buddhism and just about every other faith. It was only when her husband suggested she might want to look into the one major world religion whose founder claimed to be God that she reluctantly started to investigate Christianity. And what she found surprised her.
And so through what I see now was absolutely the hand of providence. I came across some writing that convinced me that something happened in first century Palestine surrounding the figure of Jesus Christ. You see thousands and thousands, just waves of people converting to this religion, despite the fact that it meant persecution, maybe even death, not just for them, but for their children, for their families. And you see, the Jews who had held to these institutions like animal sacrifice and all of the stuff, despite years and years of persecution, millennia of persecution, you see them abandoning all of these traditions to follow Jesus Christ. And this is the stuff I was reading in these various books. And one of these authors said, you can do all sorts of mental acrobatics to say what happened there. But, maybe the simplest explanation is that these people actually saw Jesus Christ rise from the dead. And I read that, and I think because of that prayer that I had said previously, I was open to grace in a new way. And it just, and God was able to swoop in, and I just had this moment where for the first time in my life I said, what if it's true? What if God did become a man? What if he, it's funny, I didn't understand the crucifixion yet. I didn't understand dying for our sins, but okay, so something happened with the crucifixion, and then there's this resurrection, which I actually didn't know that was what Easter celebrated. I was that isolated from Christianity. I did not know what Easter was. So that powerful what if moment was when I simultaneously became open to the idea of Jesus Christ and to the idea of a personal God.
From being a happy, lifelong atheist in her mid-20s, Jen Fulwiler, along with her husband, entered the Catholic Church in her early 30s, a convert whose journey began because she recognised the conflict between the materialist story of reality and her own experience of love. A similar pattern emerges out of many of the conversion accounts I've been seeing. Before the full embrace of Christianity, there's first an intellectual metamorphosis that takes place as the materialist worldview gets chipped away. There's often a growing sense that purpose, beauty, right and wrong really do exist, and that our emotions, thoughts and feelings can't simply be reduced to the movements of electrons in our brain. The idea that the love we feel for a newborn child, or the intensity of emotion that accompanies a stirring piece of music, that it's fully explained by a series of chemical reactions in our brain, just stops making sense. This isn't to deny that these physical phenomena are linked to those experiences. If we were being monitored by an MRI scanner, we would certainly see the appropriate parts of our brain light up during these moments. But that doesn't mean that's all that is going on. That would be a bit like looking at the notes written on the page of a Beethoven concerto and thinking we understood it without ever having heard the notes played. Meaning cannot be contained by such one-dimensional explanations. C.S. Lewis once wrote, "One who contended that a poem was nothing but black marks on white paper would be unanswerable if he addressed an audience who couldn't read. Those who can read, however, will continue to say the poem exists." I believe that in a left hemispheric dominated world, many people have simply lost the ability to read our world properly. We need to learn to read again with our whole mind. Only then will we understand what it is we're looking at. Only then will we understand the rhythm, the beauty, the sheer joy of the poem in front of us. And I believe it's happening. Could the growing wave of thinkers such as Philip Goff and Iain McGilchrist, looking for a transcendent source of consciousness, meaning, beauty and love, alongside the conversion stories of people like Jennifer Fulwiler, Sharon Dirckx and Ayaan Hirsi Ali, could these be the first ripples of a forthcoming tide of people looking for the source of meaning that they sense must exist somewhere over the horizon? You've been listening to the surprising rebirth of belief in God, telling the story of how new atheism grew old and secular thinkers are considering Christianity again. Material from The Unbelievable Show was used by permission of Premier. Visit premierunbelievable.com for full shows, or today's show notes for links to all archive materials used in this episode. And just to remind you, this podcast series is also a book. You can read the first chapter for free when you join my newsletter. That's at justinbrierley.com, and you can also order the book there or get a signed copy. Supporting via Patreon or tax-deductible giving from the USA will give you early access to new episodes of this podcast and access to bonus content. Find out more and how to support my efforts to bring thinking faith to the secular and Christian world at justinbrierley.com, or just go to the links with today's show. Coming up next time.
I was pursuing some omega point of spiritual enlightenment, and the irony, of course, was that it kept shrinking away from me and receding into the horizon as I was pursuing it. But yeah, I really felt like I was on this epic cosmic journey.
Psychedelics and the search for God. We'll hear Ashley Landy's surprising journey to faith. Today's episode was a production of Think Faith in partnership with Genexus and with support from the Jerusalem Trust. Editing assistance by Isaac Simmons. You can find links to the book and all our featured guests with the show notes. Please do subscribe to this podcast. Do rate and review us too. Tell others. Share it on your social media. It helps others to find us. And get that next episode you just heard a clip from 2 weeks early when you support now at justinbrierley.com. Again, the link is with today's show. Thanks. See you next time. Thanks for listening today, and to Ellis, who left this review saying, "One of the best podcasts I've ever listened to. Historical, insightful, reasoned, and full of heart. So necessary in a culture that has forgotten why it is like it is. Just bought the book too." If you can leave a review, it helps others to discover the show. And if you want to buy the book, like Ellis did, you can get a signed copy from my website. As it happens, gold supporters of this show get signed editions of both my books anyway, plus lots of bonus content and early access. And of course, your support makes a huge difference to me being able to produce this podcast. So for the book or to support, visit justinbrierley.com or follow the links with the show notes.